The pocket watch was no heavier than a heartbeat in Marcus Helvetia's palm. Brass worn soft by 8 decades of handling, crystal face yellowed to the color of old bone, mechanism inside still ticking with the precision of obsession. He had wound it that morning as he had every morning for 73 years, inserting the tiny key into the crown, turning 3 times counterclockwise, listening for the small resistance that meant it would survive another day. The shop smelled the way it always did in early November: horology solvent, watch oil with its specific mineral sweetness, old wood varnish, the faint electric tang of the magnifying lamp. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the cobblestones of Grindelwald's main street. The Alps rose behind the village like silent witnesses to everything that had transpired in the valley over the centuries: wars, peace treaties, the rise and fall of empires, and through it all watches had continued ticking. Marcus moved through the workshop with the muscle memory of someone who had inhabited the same space so completely that the space had become inseparable from his skin. Shelves held chronometers and pocket watches and antique wristwatches, each in its own padded niche, each catalogued in his leather journal with dates and serial numbers and the names of previous owners, some of whom had been dead longer than Switzerland had been neutral about anything. The journal sat open on his workbench, current entry dated November 6, 2024. Routine maintenance, no unusual items. The morning light filtered through the windows at that particular angle that only happened in November, casting the workshop in gold the way it had cast it every November since he had rented the space in 1952. Back then, the building had been owned by a widow whose husband had died in an industrial accident. She had been grateful to have a tenant who paid on time and never caused trouble. Marcus had been that tenant for 72 years. He was 87 years old. People in Grindelwald called him the Old Swiss, which was redundant and therefore Swiss in its precision. They saw him as part of the landscape, no more remarkable than the mountains or the weather or the trains that ran on time the way God intended. He had become invisible through sheer consistency, through being exactly what people expected him to be for so long that they stopped actually seeing him. He had a routine that hadn't varied in decades: wake at 5, coffee black with no sugar, walk to the shop by 5:30, open at 6, tend to watches until 7. Then customers would arrive, though not many. The world had moved on from pocket watches. Mechanical precision had become a fetish for people with money and nostalgia in equal measure. But the watches came anyway, brought by people who had inherited them, or who understood that some things could not be replaced by batteries and electricity. Marcus did not ask questions about where the watches came from or what they meant to their owners. He fixed things. That was enough. It had always been enough. The workbench bore the marks of 79 years of meticulous labor, deep grooves where his elbows had rested during countless hours of close inspection, burn marks from soldering irons that had slipped during moments of distraction, tiny scratches from tools that had been set down too quickly, a map of careful work written in wood grain and metal residue, a record of a life spent in patient attention to small things that mattered. Behind the bench, a wall of drawers held components sorted by size and function, with an organization that bordered on obsessive. Springs thinner than human hair, gears small enough to fit under a fingernail, jewels that caught light like captured stars, balance wheels calibrated to tolerances measured in microns. Each drawer was labeled in Marcus's precise handwriting, labels that had been rewritten every decade as the old ones faded, maintaining an archival system that only he fully understood. Marcus had learned the trade from his adopted father, a Swiss craftsman named Heinrich Müller, who had taken in the young English boy in 1946 without asking questions about where he had come from or why a 10-year-old could read technical German and perform mathematical calculations that belonged in university textbooks. The old man had simply handed Marcus a broken pocket watch, a Patek Philippe with a damaged escapement, and said, "Fix it." Marcus had fixed it. The work had taken him 3 days, working late into the night by lamplight, his small fingers learning to manipulate tools designed for adult hands. When he presented the repaired watch to Heinrich, the old man had examined it with a jeweler's loupe, checking each component, testing the timing against a master clock. Finally, he had nodded once and handed Marcus another broken watch. "Good," Heinrich had said. "Now do it again." For 79 years, Marcus had done it again, and again, and again. Thousands of watches, tens of thousands of repairs, each one a small act of restoration, each one a small victory against entropy and the passage of time. The bell above the door chimed at 9:15, the same brass bell that had been there when Marcus first rented the space, its tone deepened slightly by decades of oxidation. A woman entered, perhaps 60, with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, in a pattern that suggested she had stopped dyeing it only recently. She wore an expensive coat that showed signs of age despite its quality, expensive shoes that had been resoled at least twice, and carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She held something wrapped in cloth, worn linen the color of old flour, the kind of cloth used during wartime when nothing could be wasted. The bundle was small, roughly the size of a large pocket watch, wrapped with the kind of precision that suggested military training or long practice in preserving fragile things. Marcus did not look up from the watch he was examining, a 1923 Omega that had developed an erratic beat, gaining 6 seconds per day despite his previous adjustments. He waited, his magnifying loupe still fixed to his eye, his hands continuing their work with the kind of focus that made customers understand they should not interrupt. People who came to watchmakers came because they needed something fixed. They would explain their needs when he was ready to hear them, or they would not explain at all. Either way, the watch would tell him the truth. Watches always did. They couldn't lie about their condition, couldn't hide their damage behind words or excuses. You opened them up and saw exactly what was wrong. The woman set the bundle on the counter with a motion so slow and deliberate it seemed choreographed. Not careful. Careful would suggest nervousness, uncertainty. This was controlled, purposeful, like someone setting down something dangerous that they understood completely, handling it with respect but without fear. She unwrapped it with the same precision she had used to carry it, layer by layer, each fold revealing more of what lay beneath. The cloth fell away like secrets being deliberately exposed, and there on the counter sat a pocket watch, unlike any Marcus had seen in 70 years of repair work. It was old, certainly, 1930s perhaps, though the heavy corrosion made precise dating difficult without opening it. The case was silver-tarnished to the color of storm clouds, the kind of patina that came from decades of neglect in environments that alternated between extreme humidity and dryness. The crystal was intact, which was rare for a watch in this condition, but clouded inside with moisture and age, the condensation patterns suggesting the watch had been stored somewhere sealed but not climate-controlled. The dial had faded to a pale cream, numerals almost invisible except where rust from the deteriorating mechanism had stained them darker. The hands had frozen at 3:15, though whether that was 3:15 in the afternoon or morning, and which day of which year, was impossible to say. But the back cover, when she turned it over with fingers that showed faint scars Marcus recognized as old surgical marks, showed something that made him set down his tools with extreme care. An inscription, hand-engraved with professional precision despite the oxidation that nearly obscured it. GX 1847X. Marcus felt his pulse accelerate slightly, a physical response he hadn't experienced in decades. The serial number format was wrong. Not wrong like a forgery, but wrong like something that shouldn't exist in civilian hands. Military designation, experimental procurement, the kind of numbering system used for equipment that would never appear in official inventories. He looked up slowly, deliberately setting aside the Omega and removing his loupe. The woman was watching him with eyes that did not blink as often as they should, pale gray eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw, filing details away with mechanical precision. "I need you to open it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but carried perfect clarity, the kind of voice that came from years of speaking softly in rooms where being overheard meant death. "Not repair it, not clean it, open it." Marcus picked up the watch, feeling its weight, examining the way it had been sealed. The case was soldered shut, and not with the kind of soldering a jeweler would do for a standard repair. This was military work, permanent, precise, designed to create a seal that would survive underwater immersion, extreme temperatures, rough handling. The kind of work done in a war. "You understand that opening it will likely destroy the seal," he said, his voice steady despite the questions multiplying in his mind. "The case appears to have been deliberately sealed against environmental contamination. Breaking that seal may damage whatever is inside." "I understand. You may damage the mechanism beyond repair. I know. This watch may be irreplaceable. If it has historical significance, then that's why I brought it to someone irreplaceable." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some old weight that had been sleeping for decades beginning to stir, like a hibernating animal sensing spring. The weight had names attached to it, faces he had tried for 79 years not to remember, voices speaking in rooms that officially no longer existed in any archive or historical record. He set the watch down with extreme care, as if it might detonate, and walked to the back of his workshop. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor that he noticed with clinical detachment, as if observing someone else's nervous system responding to stimulus. He had not allowed his hands to shake in 52 years. Not when his adopted father Heinrich died in 1972, leaving him truly alone in the world. Not when Switzerland joined the United Nations in 2002, ending centuries of absolute neutrality. Not when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and he understood that the Cold War world he had helped create was finally, truly over, along with any remaining justification for the work he had done. But they were shaking now. Behind the counter, hidden on a shelf he had not opened since 1968, sat a small box. Mahogany with brass corners, locked with a mechanism so old the tumblers had fused partially from disuse and oxidation. He retrieved the key from the lining of his jacket, a key he had carried every day of his life since 1946, sewn into a hidden pocket he recreated in every coat he owned, transferred with religious care each time he bought new clothes. The key itself was brass, worn smooth by decades of being carried against his body, warmed by his heat, shaped slightly by the pressure of his movements. He had never used it in 56 years, had never needed to, but he had kept it close anyway, the way soldiers keep dog tags even after the war ends, the way priests keep rosaries even after faith fades. He worked the key carefully into the lock. The mechanism resisted. Rust and time had made conspirators against him. Marcus applied gentle pressure, feeling the ancient springs protest with tiny vibrations transmitted through the metal into his fingertips. He increased the pressure incrementally, monitoring the resistance, judging how much force the corroded mechanism could withstand before something broke. The lock clicked open with a sound like a bone breaking, sharp, final, irreversible. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had yellowed with age, was a photograph. Black and white, the edges creased and soft from handling that had stopped decades ago, but whose effects remained. The image showed 7 men in a room designed to contain secrets. No windows, concrete walls, a single door visible in the background with an armed guard stationed beside it. The men wore civilian clothes, but stood with military bearing. The youngest, perhaps 30 years old, was thin and intense, his eyes focused on something beyond the camera's frame. That was Marcus. Or rather, that was the person Marcus had been before he became Marcus Helvetia. Beside him stood 6 others, whose names he had tried for 79 years to forget. Names that had once been as familiar as his own. Names that had meant survival and trust and shared purpose in the last desperate years of the war. Bletchley Park, January 1945. The photograph was labeled on the back in handwriting he no longer recognized as his own, in pencil that had faded to barely legible gray. Crosswind Operational Unit, Cryptanalysis Division, final briefing before deployment to European theater. He had not thought about Crosswind in so long that the memory felt false, like something from a dream he had been having without knowing it, a nightmare that visited while he slept and evaporated upon waking, leaving only the emotional residue of fear and loss and a guilt he couldn't quite name. But here was the evidence. 7 men who had never officially existed. 7 names that appeared in no military records, no intelligence files, no historical accounts of World War II or its aftermath. 7 ghosts who had broken codes that changed the course of the war, then been asked to simply disappear, to become invisible, to live out their lives as ordinary citizens while carrying secrets that could never be told. 5 of them were dead now. Marcus knew, because he had tracked their obituaries over the decades, reading between the lines of brief notices in Swiss and German and British newspapers. The notices never mentioned military service, never acknowledged what these men had actually accomplished, just died peacefully, survived by, memorial service to be announced. Heart attack, 1967, car accident, 1981, stroke, 1995, cancer, 2003, pneumonia, 2011. Each death noted without ceremony, without acknowledgement of what these men had actually done, who they had actually been beneath the civilian identities they wore like masks. One remained besides Marcus, the 7th member of Crosswind, the one they had all protected most carefully because her identity as a female operative made her the most vulnerable to exposure and reprisal in the decades after the war, when such things were not officially acknowledged. And Marcus had spent 79 years assuming that person was also dead, erased by time or intention or the simple mathematics of mortality. The kind of death that came quietly to those who lived quietly, noticed by no one except family, commemorated in no historical record. He returned to the counter carrying the photograph like a piece of his own skeleton, something that had been buried deep but remained connected to who he was. The woman had not moved. She stood in exactly the same position, her hands resting on the counter in precisely the same configuration, her pale gray eyes fixed on him with the same patient intensity. "You know what this is," she said, not a question, not a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had been waiting decades to hear confirmation. "I know what it should be impossible for it to be," Marcus replied, his voice steadier now, the professional discipline of 79 years of careful living reasserting itself over the shock of recognition. "Then you understand why it exists." Marcus picked up the watch again, feeling its weight differently now. Not just metal and corrosion and frozen time. A message, a proof, a claim on a past he had tried to bury beneath routine and forgetfulness. His hands had stopped shaking, replaced by something colder, more professional. The steadiness of a man doing work that mattered, work that frightened him more than anything had frightened him in 50 years, but work that he understood in his bones, in the muscle memory of skills he had tried for decades to forget, but which remained carved into his nervous system like scars. "I'll need tools," he said, "specialized tools. It will take time to open this without destroying whatever is inside." "How long?" 3 hours, perhaps more. The seal is extensive. The corrosion is severe. If I rush, I risk destroying whatever you need me to find." She nodded once, a gesture so economical it seemed military. "I'll wait. There are cafes. The shop will be cold. I keep the heat low to protect the watches. I'll wait here." Marcus set up his workstation with the kind of ritual precision he usually reserved for the most delicate restorations, antique pieces whose value exceeded their function, whose historical significance demanded perfection. He arranged his tools with geometric exactness, high magnification lamp positioned at precisely 30 degrees to eliminate shadows while minimizing heat, precision files arranged in order from coarsest to finest, chemical solvents organized by reactivity. The soldering iron heated slowly to exactly 315 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt the seal without damaging anything beneath. He worked with the same meticulous attention he had once applied to breaking codes, understanding patterns, seeing what should not exist and making sense of it anyway. The kind of work that required holding 2 contradictory truths in your mind simultaneously. This cannot be real, and yet here it is, demanding to be understood. The solder came away in thin silver lines, peeling back like skin from an old wound. Each line revealed a layer of oxidation beneath, which he removed with increasingly fine files and brushes, working inward toward the seal itself. The process was archaeological, removing layers of time and neglect to reach something that had been deliberately preserved. 3 hours became 4. 4 became 5. Marcus worked without breaks, his focus absolute, his hands steady. The woman watched from her position at the counter, never moving, never showing impatience, as comfortable with silence as Marcus was. Finally, as the afternoon light was beginning to fade outside the workshop windows, the case yielded. It opened with a soft mechanical sigh, the sound of pressure equalizing after 8 decades of being sealed, the sound of secrets finally permitted to escape their containment. Inside, the mechanism was intact. Not just intact, pristine. Every gear and spring and jewel exactly where it should be, protected by the seal from the oxidation that had ravaged the exterior. A beautiful piece of Swiss engineering, every component placed with the precision that marked it as pre-war work, from an era when watchmakers still signed their mechanisms with pride. But Marcus barely noticed the mechanism. His attention was fixed on something else, something that should not have been there, something that changed everything. Beneath the mechanical works, hidden in a specially constructed compartment that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, was a piece of paper. Not ordinary paper, this was photograph paper, the kind used during the war for microfilm documentation. Aged to a yellow-brown that suggested it had been sealed in darkness since 1945. Brittle enough that touching it wrong would reduce it to powder and destroy whatever information it contained. Marcus used a jeweler's pick with a tip finer than a human hair to extract it with surgical care. The paper unfolded in his hands like something alive and terrified, each crease threatening to become a tear, each movement risking the destruction of information that had survived 8 decades of careful preservation. The paper contained a list written in a cipher he recognized immediately, the way you recognize a language you spoke as a child and tried for decades to forget. The symbols and numbers resolved themselves in his mind without conscious effort, his brain automatically beginning the process of translation, even as he tried not to understand what he was reading. Not enigma, something more sophisticated, more elegant, more secure. A polyalphabetic substitution system with variable key lengths that changed based on temporal factors, date, time, even atmospheric pressure. The kind of cipher that could only be broken if you knew the exact moment and conditions under which it was created, or if you were one of the 7 people who had designed it. It had been destroyed in 1946 when Crosswind was officially terminated. All documentation burned in a furnace at Bletchley Park under the supervision of military intelligence officers who understood that some secrets were too dangerous to preserve even in classified archives. Except it hadn't been destroyed. Not entirely. Because here it was, written on photograph paper, sealed in a watch, carried through 7 decades by someone who had kept faith with a promise Marcus had forgotten he'd made. A cipher that only 7 people in the world had ever understood how to decode. 6 of them were dead, their knowledge lost, their part of the collective memory erased. And one of them was standing in his workshop in Grindelwald, Switzerland, watching him read a piece of paper that should not exist. The woman spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying perfect clarity in the silent shop. Those names, those locations, those dates, they represent safe houses, supply depots, communication dead drops, emergency extraction points, people who continued the work after the war ended, people who were never supposed to be found, people who kept faith. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, seeing past the gray hair and the aged face to the structure beneath. The bone structure that didn't change with age, the geometry that remained constant, even as skin sagged and muscles weakened. The way she held herself, the pattern of scars visible on her hands, the precise economy of her movements. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it the moment she set the watch on his counter, had been denying it because accepting it meant accepting that everything he thought he knew about the past 79 years had been carefully constructed fiction. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, retired," she said. "Though I've been many people since then. The last official identity was Margaret Southwell. Before that, Catherine Marsh, then Diane Abbott, then Susan Palmer, then Ruth Blackwood. Perhaps a dozen others I've half forgotten. Identities accumulated like scar tissue, each one covering the one before, each one a little harder to remember as real. But originally, in a room in Bletchley Park in January 1945, I was Crosswind 7. Sarah Chen had been assigned to the Crosswind unit in late 1944, recruited directly from Cambridge, where she had been completing a mathematics doctorate at age 19. They brought her in because she had a photographic memory that bordered on eidetic, and because she was female, and therefore invisible to the German intelligence services, which seemed to think that women could not possibly be involved in cryptanalysis, espionage, or anything that required analytical thinking beyond domestic management. The Germans had been spectacularly wrong about that assumption, which had cost them the war in ways they never fully understood. Sarah had broken 17 separate Enigma variants in 3 months, working 20-hour days in rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular staleness of air recycled through buildings where windows couldn't be opened for security reasons. She had identified 3 separate Nazi intelligence networks operating in neutral countries by recognizing pattern similarities in seemingly unrelated intercepted communications, connections that existed only in the statistical relationships between messages sent weeks apart from different locations. She had saved the lives of at least 400 Allied soldiers by predicting German movements 2 weeks in advance during the final push into Germany. Her analyses so precise that field commanders started requesting her assessments by name, even though her name appeared in no official roster, no table of organization, no chain of command. After the war, when Crosswind was dismantled and all records sealed under national security directives that would remain classified for the next century, she had been offered 2 choices that weren't really choices at all: disappear with a pension and a new identity, or die in an accident that everyone would believe was real and that would require no uncomfortable questions at congressional oversight hearings. She had chosen disappearance, which meant choosing a kind of death anyway. The death of Sarah Chen, the death of the person she had been, the death of any future that involved being acknowledged for what she had accomplished. She had become invisible by simply continuing to exist, becoming so ordinary that no one would ever look at her closely enough to see what she had been. A secretary in London for 8 years, a librarian in Edinburgh for 12, a translator in Geneva for 15, always moving before anyone noticed she didn't age quite right, before friendships became deep enough to require real history, before questions about her past became too persistent to deflect with vague references to family troubles and wartime dislocations. 79 years of invisibility, 79 years of living under false names, maintaining false histories, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to notice the inconsistencies that accumulated around the edges of her carefully constructed identities. 79 years of carrying secrets that would die with her unless someone chose to remember, unless someone decided that the truth mattered more than the comfortable fictions that had been agreed upon in 1946. And now she was standing in a watch shop in Switzerland, asking Marcus to decode a cipher that connected every Crosswind operative who had continued working in the shadows after the war officially ended, after the victory parades, after the tribunals, after the world had moved on to new conflicts and new certainties. "That can't still be active," Marcus said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse, uncertain, the voice of someone whose foundational assumptions about reality were crumbling beneath the weight of evidence. Not after 80 years, not without support, not without institutional backing, not without the organizational infrastructure that something like that requires. "It is," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "We are. 63 operatives at peak strength, down to 3 now. Most died of natural causes, a few from unnatural ones. But the network persisted, the protocols held, the promise was kept." She pulled up her left sleeve with the same deliberate precision she had used to unwrap the watch. A scar ran along her forearm, thin and white and precise as a surgical incision, which is exactly what it was. The kind of scar left by the removal of something that had been placed under the skin with the expectation it would remain there permanently. Subcutaneous tracker, she explained, her voice clinical, detached, as if describing someone else's body. Implanted in 1945 by OSS medical staff. Radio frequency identification, primitive by today's standards but cutting edge then. Removed in 1947 when I realized that the people who had promised us safety were also the people who might someday decide we knew too much, that our continued existence represented an inconvenient complication to official histories being written. She lowered her sleeve, covering the scar again. But there were others who kept theirs, who believed the promises, who trusted that the governments we had served would protect us. 63 operatives total, across 23 countries when the network was fully operational. We checked in quarterly using protocols established before the peace treaties were signed. Coordinates transmitted in cipher, status reports encoded in dead drops, operational capability assessed through indirect channels, all written in variations of the cipher you're holding, all hidden in locations where we knew to look. Safe houses that were established before anyone thought the war would actually end. Networks that survived because they were never supposed to exist in the first place. Marcus felt the shop spinning slightly, his equilibrium disrupted by information that didn't fit into any framework he had constructed for understanding the world over the past 7 decades. He set down the paper with extreme care, placing it on a white cloth to protect it from his skin oils as if it were radioactive, which in a sense it was, capable of destroying everything it touched if handled incorrectly. "If this cipher is broken," he said slowly, each word carefully measured, "if the locations are exposed, if anyone with hostile intent gets access to this information, you understand what happens. Everyone in those safe houses will die, not from age, not from natural causes, from enemies that have been waiting 79 years for exactly this opportunity. From intelligence services that would rather erase witnesses than admit what was done in the name of security. From people who have long memories and longer grudges." "I know," Sarah said. "Then why did you bring it to me? Why not destroy it? Why not let it disappear with you when you die, which given your age cannot be more than a few years away at most? Why not take the secret to your grave like the other 5 did?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, a weight settling, a decision made long ago finally being acknowledged aloud, brought into the light after decades of being carried in darkness. "Because we're dying," she said. "The people who remember what Crosswind actually was, what it actually accomplished, what it still actually does, we're aging out. In 10 years, there will be no one left who can verify that this network ever existed. In 15 years, the safe houses will be abandoned, the protocols forgotten, the dead drops lost, the whole infrastructure dismantled through simple entropy. In 20 years, the entire history will be nothing but rumors and fragments and the kind of truth that official records deny because it's easier than admitting what was done in the name of national security." She paused, her gaze moving past Marcus to the shelves of watches behind him, hundreds of them marking time in their own ways, each one a small machine designed to resist the erasure of moments, to insist that time matters, that what happens in time deserves to be recorded and remembered. "I brought this watch to you because you're the only living person besides me who knows this cipher, because you're the only person who can verify that it's real, that the network is real, that the work we did mattered beyond the immediate tactical victories. Because when historians finally ask the question that's been waiting 79 years to be asked, what happened to the people who knew too much? There needs to be a witness. There needs to be someone who can say with authority they didn't disappear. They were here. They continued. They mattered. They deserve to be remembered." Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the snow that was falling heavier now, covering Grindelwald's streets with white, making the village look like a Christmas card, picturesque and false. Outside, the mountains rose in their eternal patience, indifferent to human concerns, unmoved by secrets or revelations, marking time in geological epochs, while human dramas played out in the briefness of individual lives. "When I left Bletchley Park," he said quietly, his breath fogging the glass, In March 1946, 3 months after this photograph was taken, I was told I was being given a gift, a new identity, a new life, safety, a chance to be normal after years of living with the knowledge that people died or lived based on whether I correctly decoded a message before dawn. They told me the work was done, the war was won, the codes were broken, the enemy was defeated. I could forget what I had done, become someone ordinary, live a normal life with normal concerns, marriage, children, a trade, a retirement, a grave in a local cemetery with a simple stone. He turned back to face her, his reflection ghostly in the window glass behind him. I did forget, or I tried to. God knows I tried. I spent 70 years trying to forget. I became Marcus Helvetia so completely that sometimes I couldn't remember who I had been before. I learned to fix watches because watches made sense. You could open them up and see exactly what was wrong, and if you were patient and precise, you could fix it. And when you were done, it worked or it didn't, with no ambiguity, no moral complexity, no people dying because you made a calculation error. I paid my taxes. I went to church on Christmas. I smiled at neighbors. I fixed their watches. I never spoke about the war. I never claimed to be anything other than what I appeared to be. And somewhere in that forgetting, while I was being normal and ordinary and safe, you were all still out there, still working, still risking everything, still maintaining networks that were supposed to have been dismantled decades ago. All so that I could live this ordinary life, all so that one of us could actually have what we were promised: peace, anonymity, safety. Yes, Sarah said simply. We made a choice. It was the choice we made together, all 7 of us, in the last week of 1945, in a room that has since been demolished, speaking words that were never recorded, making promises that appeared in no official documentation. We understood that Crosswind had accomplished something that could never be undone. We had created a structure, a network, a way of moving information and resources across borders without official knowledge or approval. We had established protocols and dead drops and safe houses and emergency extraction procedures. We understood that the war was over, but the certainties that came from war would never be over. There would always be people who needed protection from governments, from intelligence services, from the kind of people who used power without accountability. There would always be truths that needed to be preserved outside official channels, because official channels could be controlled, sanitized, rewritten to serve present needs rather than preserve past realities. There would always be work to do for people willing to remember that governments lie, that official histories omit inconvenient truths, that someone needs to bear witness. So we decided to keep it alive. Smaller than it had been during the war, more careful, more selective. Hidden behind 7 separate lives, each of us living as ordinarily as possible while maintaining one thread of the network. You were given the deepest cover because your mathematical abilities were the most valuable and therefore the most dangerous. If hostile intelligence services had identified you as a cryptanalyst, they would have targeted you, used you, killed you once you were no longer useful. We protected you by letting you forget, by carrying the operational burden ourselves, by making sure that even if 6 of us were exposed, you would remain hidden, safe, able to testify when the time came that yes, this actually happened. This work was actually done. These people actually existed. Marcus felt his legs weaken slightly, the weight of 79 years of deception, both his own forgetting and their active protection, pressing down on him with sudden force. He reached out to steady himself against the counter, his watchmaker's hands gripping the wood with enough force to make his knuckles white. "How many are still alive?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How many of us remain?" 3, including you and me," Sarah said. "Crosswind 3 is in Prague. Pavel Dvorak, under his current identity, though I knew him as James Morrison during the war. He's 91 years old, still operational, still maintaining his section of the network in Eastern Europe. Still running the same safe house he established in 1947, still using the same dead drop he set up in 1951. Crosswind 5 is in São Paulo, Maria Santos now, though she was Elizabeth Wright when we worked together. She's 89, still active, still providing safe harbor for people who need to disappear, still keeping faith. She paused, her pale gray eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen being examined, catalogued, assessed for continued usefulness. "And you," she continued, "Marcus Helvetia, Crosswind 1, the man who spent 79 years fixing watches in a mountain town while remaining connected to a network that never officially existed, whether you remembered that connection or not. The man whose cover was so deep that even he forgot it was a cover. The man we protected because protecting you was our mission, our purpose, our way of ensuring that someone survived to tell the truth. We kept you alive," she said. "Every name on this list has protected you at some point over the last 79 years, even if you never knew it. Every safe house would have hidden you if MI6 or CIA or Soviet intelligence had come looking. Every person in this network has spent decades understanding that if Crosswind was exposed, you would be exposed too. Your safety was our mission. That was the covenant we made in 1945. That was the promise we kept. And now I'm asking you to keep faith with us by remembering, by decoding this cipher, by being the witness we always knew we would eventually need." Marcus released his grip on the counter, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. 79 years. 79 years of living a lie so complete that it had become true. 79 years of other people carrying a weight he hadn't even known existed, maintaining a structure he had forgotten was there, protecting a version of him that he had allowed himself to believe was all he ever was. "I can't read this," he said finally, his voice emerging rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "I can't decode this cipher and live with myself, knowing what I'm revealing. I can't be responsible for exposing everyone on this list, for making them vulnerable after they spent their entire lives maintaining security, keeping faith, protecting people like me who were allowed to forget." "Then don't decode it," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "Destroy it. That's what most people would do. Take the watch, take the paper, burn them both in your workshop furnace and go back to your routine. No one would know except you and me. No one would ever find out. The network would continue as it has for 79 years. You would continue as Marcus Helvetia, watchmaker. Your secret would remain your secret. Your comfortable forgetting would remain undisturbed." She picked up the watch from the counter, held it gently in her palm, her scarred fingers cradling it with the same care Marcus used for the most delicate repairs. "But then when I die, which will be soon, I'm 102 years old, and my doctors tell me I have perhaps 2 years remaining. And when Pavel dies, and when Maria dies, that's the end of it. The witnesses disappear, the history evaporates, the network collapses, the safe houses are abandoned, the dead drops are forgotten, the protocols die with us. And 79 years from now, some graduate student will find documentation of Crosswind in a newly declassified file. And there will be no one alive to say what it really meant, what it really cost, who paid the price, whether it mattered, whether we mattered." Marcus picked up the paper again, feeling its fragility, understanding that he held in his hands something irreplaceable, not just the information encoded in the cipher, but the physical artifact of someone's faith that truth mattered enough to preserve across decades of danger and secrecy. His hands did not shake. The steadiness had returned, not the false steadiness of forgetfulness, but the real steadiness that came from understanding that you were being presented with a choice that would define the rest of your life and whatever legacy you left behind. Whether you lived as a witness or died as an accomplice to your own erasure, whether you carried forward the truth or let it die with you to preserve your comfort. "I'll decode it," he said, his voice clear and certain now. "But not here, not in Grindelwald. If I do this, I disappear from here. I assume you have a way to make that happen. I assume that after 79 years of maintaining this network, you have procedures for extraction, for protection, for keeping people safe while they do dangerous work." "I do," Sarah said. "A place prepared in 1946, maintained since then, never used until now, but kept ready against the possibility that one of us would need it. Waiting all this time. In 3 days, you'll drive to Zurich. A car will be waiting outside the main railway station at exactly 14 Uhr. You'll be taken to a location where you can work safely, where you'll have access to everything you need. Reference materials, proper lighting, the time and solitude necessary for work that can't be rushed. You'll spend as much time as you need decoding the cipher, weeks if necessary, months, however long it takes to do it right. When you finish, you'll be given a choice. Come back here to Grindelwald and live out your remaining years in peace, knowing what you know but never speaking of it publicly, taking the truth to your grave the way the other 5 did. Or come forward, go public, testify before whatever governmental body will listen, accept that your 79-year retirement was always going to end this way, that the forgetting was only ever temporary, that some debts can't be paid except by remembering. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that he was agreeing to more than just decoding a cipher. He was agreeing to remember, to bear witness, to carry the weight that the others had been carrying for him all these years. "I'll need to close the shop," he said, looking around at the workspace that had been his entire world for 7 decades. "Make arrangements, leave notes for customers about their repairs. Say goodbye to the people here who think they know me, though I suppose they never really did, since they only ever knew Marcus Helvetia the watchmaker, not whoever I was before that." "I understand," Sarah said. 3 days should be enough for arrangements. We've learned to move quickly when necessary." He set the watch and the paper in a velvet-lined case, placing them beside the 1923 Omega that had brought Sarah through his door 4 hours earlier. Outside, the November snow was falling thicker now, covering the streets of Grindelwald with white, making the world smaller and softer and less real, as if someone had decided that reality needed to be muffled, made gentler, prepared for transformation. Marcus locked the shop at noon on November 6, 2024. He left a note on the door. "Closed due to family emergency. Repairs will be delayed. Apologies for any inconvenience." The note was technically true, if you considered Crosswind a family, which in the deepest sense it was. The only family that had ever really known him. The only people who had ever understood what he actually was, beneath the performance of ordinariness he had maintained for most of his life. No one in Grindelwald had known that Marcus Helvetia had a family. No one had asked. For 79 years he had been the quiet watchmaker who lived alone, worked alone, attended occasional town meetings, but never volunteered for committees, maintained cordial but distant relationships with neighbors, and generally existed as a benign fixture of the community, reliable, unexciting, unremarkable. Now they would assume he had abandoned the property, left for some family emergency that proved terminal, died somewhere else with his body claimed by relatives who didn't bother returning for his things. The landlord would eventually assume he was dead, would catalogue the inventory, would sell the watches at auction or donate them to a museum. The journal would be left in a drawer, its final entry for November 6th reading simply, "Routine maintenance, no unusual items." The drive to Zurich took 2 hours through mountain passes, already white with early snow. Marcus drove with careful precision, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind already beginning the preliminary work of decryption, even though he didn't yet have the full cipher in front of him. Pattern recognition was automatic for him, had been since childhood. He couldn't stop his brain from looking for structure, for meaning, for the mathematics underlying apparent randomness. The rental car was anonymous, paid for in cash from the account he hadn't touched in 40 years, an account that apparently still existed, still accumulated modest interest, still waited for exactly this kind of need. He would leave the car in Zurich and never think of it again. The car was waiting exactly where Sarah had said it would be. A black Mercedes with diplomatic plates and windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. The driver stood beside it, middle-aged, professional, wearing a suit that suggested government service without identifying which government. He opened the rear door without speaking, without asking for identification, apparently already knowing who Marcus was or trusting Sarah's instructions implicitly. Marcus got in the back seat, holding a single leather bag containing his life condensed to its essentials. A change of clothes, his grandfather's watch kept through everything, toiletries, the key to the mahogany box that he no longer needed but couldn't bring himself to leave behind. A photograph of Heinrich Müller, who had been the closest thing to a father he had ever known. And in his mind, 79 years of trying to forget how to do the work he was about to do. The facility was not what he expected. He had anticipated something militaristic. Concrete bunkers, armed guards, security checkpoints, the apparatus of official secrets. Instead, it was a modest house in the Appenzell region, surrounded by forests old enough to have witnessed the war and everything that came after, accessible only by a private road that wound through trees like a secret being slowly revealed. The kind of place you could hide in plain sight, because there was nothing about it that suggested it needed hiding. Just another mountain house, perhaps a vacation property, perhaps a retirement cottage, unremarkable except for its isolation and the fact that someone had been maintaining it with meticulous care for 8 decades. The interior was sparse but thoughtfully arranged. A living space with comfortable furniture that showed signs of occasional use, a workshop equipped with everything a cryptanalyst might need, a library whose shelves held reference materials that had been regularly updated. Marcus could see publication dates ranging from 1946 to 2024, a continuous record of someone ensuring that whoever eventually came here would have access to current information. The kitchen showed signs of recent use. The sink was clean but water-stained in a way that suggested regular cleaning. The refrigerator hummed quietly, stocked with food that had been rotated to ensure nothing expired. Someone had been coming here regularly, maintaining it, keeping it ready, for 79 years, waiting for this moment. Sarah met him at the door, having arrived earlier by some means she didn't explain. She had changed clothes again, now wearing practical work clothes, dark pants, a sweater. Her hair tied back severely in a way that made her look more like the young cryptanalyst she had been in 1945 than the aged woman she was now. The watch and the paper lay on the workshop table under a protective glass case, illuminated by a lamp positioned to minimize heat while providing perfect visibility. "You have as long as you need," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been in command for decades. A week, a month, a year if necessary. There are grocers in the nearest village who deliver. They've been making deliveries here occasionally for years. They won't think anything unusual about increased frequency. The library has been updated with every major publication on cryptanalysis, military history, and related topics. No one comes here uninvited. No one knows you're here except you, me, Pavel in Prague, Maria in São Paulo, and one MI6 handler who has known about the network for 40 years and is currently dying of pancreatic cancer. 5 people in the world. That's as safe as it gets. That's as much security as anyone can provide. Marcus sat at the workshop table, the same kind of table he had worked at for 79 years, but put to a completely different purpose. He picked up the paper with hands that remembered professional carefulness, habits that had never actually been forgotten, just redirected toward less dangerous work. The cipher began to resolve itself immediately, patterns emerging like a landscape clearing after fog, the mathematical structures revealing themselves with a clarity that made him realize how much of his mind he had been suppressing for decades, how much intellectual capacity he had deliberately left unused because using it meant remembering who he had been. The first location decoded in less than an hour, a safe house in Prague. Coordinates precise to within 10 meters. Contact protocols specifying how to identify yourself, how to request sanctuary, how to verify that the safe house was still operational and hadn't been compromised. Emergency evacuation routes if the safe house was raided. Backup locations if the primary site was unusable. Every contingency planned for, every possibility accounted for. The second location took slightly longer. Tel Aviv. Different protocols, different contacts, same basic structure. The network had been designed with redundancy, with the assumption that parts of it would inevitably be compromised or lost, that survival required dispersal and duplication of capabilities. A safe house in Seoul, another in São Paulo, Istanbul, Montreal, Berlin, London, Cairo, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, 23 locations across every continent except Antarctica. 23 places where Crosswind operatives had been living, working, maintaining connections to a network that had never appeared in any official record, any intelligence budget, any oversight committee review. 23 names he had never heard, but somehow knew anyway. The way you know family you've never met but who share your blood, your history, your fundamental identity. And as he decoded, as the patterns revealed themselves with increasing speed, as his mind remembered how to do this work, Marcus began to understand what the real gift had been. Not the escape in 1946, not the new identity, not the 79 years of safety and anonymity and the quiet life of a watchmaker in a Swiss village. The real gift, now revealed through the act of decoding, was the knowledge that he had never been alone. That somewhere in the world, 6 other people had made the same choice he had agreed to the same devil's bargain: disappear, forget, become ordinary, and in exchange receive safety, peace, a chance at normalcy. But unlike him, the other 6 hadn't forgotten. They had remembered, they had kept working. They had maintained the network not because they had to, but because they chose to, because they understood that the work mattered beyond the immediate tactical considerations that had motivated it during the war. They had done it to protect people who needed protection, to preserve truths that official histories wanted to forget, to maintain institutional memory outside official channels that could be manipulated or erased. And they had done it to protect him specifically, to ensure that at least one of them could actually have what they had all been promised: a normal life, free from the burden of secrets and the danger of being someone who knew too much. His survival, his peaceful 79 years, his ability to forget, all of it had been made possible by their sacrifice, their choice to remember when they could have forgotten, their decision to carry the weight so he wouldn't have to. Marcus worked for 6 days without sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch. The work consumed him in a way nothing had consumed him since 1945, pulled him into a state of flow where hours passed without notice, where the only thing that existed was the pattern, the cipher, the slow revelation of structure beneath apparent randomness. On the 7th day, he had decoded everything. Every location verified, every name translated from cipher to clear text. Every protocol understood, every contingency mapped. He had verified the mathematical soundness of the cipher, confirmed that the information was current and relevant, checked it against everything he knew about cryptanalytic techniques to ensure it couldn't be easily broken by modern computational methods. The network was not a historical artifact preserved in amber, a relic of a war that ended 8 decades ago. It was a functioning intelligence apparatus that had been operating continuously since 1945, staffed by people who should have been dead or retired, maintained by connections that should have been severed, carrying forward information that should have been destroyed, providing services that no official agency was willing or able to provide. When he finished, Marcus sat in the darkness of the workshop and understood with perfect clarity that his life as Marcus Helvetia, watchmaker in Grindelwald, Switzerland, was over. The cover was blown. The retirement had ended. The forgetting was finished. Whatever time he had left would be spent as someone different, not the person he had been before 1946, because that person was gone forever, but someone new, someone who remembered, someone who chose to bear witness. Sarah came to him on the 8th day, finding him still at the workshop table, surrounded by pages of decoded cipher, reference materials, verification calculations. "Marcus," she said quietly. "I've decoded everything," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "All 23 locations, all 63 names, though 47 of them are marked deceased, all the protocols, all the contingencies, the entire network structure. It's beautiful in its way, elegant, robust, designed to survive exactly the kind of decay and entropy that would destroy a more centralized system." "I know," Sarah said. "I watched you work. Are you ready to make the choice?" Marcus stood, his body stiff from days of sitting, his mind clear in a way it hadn't been in decades. "I am. And the choice is?" "I want them to know," he said. "I want the historians to know. I want the world to know. Not everything, Some of the protocols need to remain classified to protect people who are still operational, still vulnerable. But the fact that this existed, that these people devoted their lives to work that officially never happened, that we mattered, that we weren't just ghosts in the machinery of intelligence agencies, but actual people who made actual choices that had actual consequences. I want that known. I want that remembered. I want witnesses to know there were witnesses. Even though it means your cover is blown, Sarah said, not a question, but a confirmation. Even though it means people will come looking for you, asking questions you'll have to answer. Even though it means the safe houses will have to be abandoned and the network will have to transform into something new or die entirely. Even though it means you're betraying the covenant we made in 1945 to disappear, to forget, to become invisible. Yes, Marcus said, all of that, because I'm 87 years old. I have maybe 10 years left if I'm exceptionally lucky, more likely 5. I want to spend them as a witness instead of a ghost. I want to testify. I want to sit in front of historians and government records committees and journalists and congressional oversight committees, and I want to tell them what Crosswind was, what it accomplished, what we did, who died, who survived, why it mattered. I'm tired of lies. I'm tired of forgetting. I'm tired of being comfortable while other people carry the weight of memory. Zara smiled, thin and sad and relieved all at once, the smile of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for too long and was finally being joined in the carrying. Then let's make sure the truth survives you, survives all of us. Let's make sure that when we're gone, something remains besides classified files and official denials. The congressional hearing was held on January 15, 2025, in a secure room in the Capitol building designed for classified testimony. The room was wood-paneled and official and intimidating in the way that places designed to contain power always are. The ceiling was high, designed to make witnesses feel small. The lighting was carefully arranged to illuminate the witness table while keeping the committee members slightly shadowed, a subtle power dynamic built into the architecture. The cameras were positioned to capture everything for the classified record that would eventually be declassified. Though when that would happen was anyone's guess. 10 years, 20, 50, perhaps not until everyone involved was dead and the political consequences of revelation had faded into historical curiosity. Marcus sat at the witness table wearing a suit he did not own before that morning, purchased specifically for this purpose by someone in Sarah's network, gray and severe and conservative in a way that suggested seriousness, reliability, someone whose testimony should be taken seriously. He had removed the old pocket watch from his wrist and left it in a safe deposit box in Zurich, feeling like he was leaving behind the last physical tether to the identity he had worn for 79 years. The committee chair, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper questions, asked him to state his name and profession and explain his connection to the intelligence operation known as Crosswind. Marcus took a breath, looked directly at the committee and began, "My name is Marcus Helvetia, though that is not the name I was born with. My birth name is classified and has been for 80 years. I don't even know if I'm still legally permitted to speak it aloud, though I suspect at this point it hardly matters. I was born in 1936 in Cambridge, England, to parents whose names also remain classified. I was recruited into government code and cipher school, what later became GCHQ, in 1943, when I was 7 years old." He paused. Let that sink in. I know how that sounds. 7 years old. But the war demanded extraordinary measures, and I had demonstrated certain cognitive abilities that the British government was very interested in, specifically pattern recognition and mathematical analysis at levels that exceeded most adult specialists in the field. I could look at a page of encrypted text and see structure where others saw only randomness. I could hold complex algorithms in my head and manipulate them without writing anything down. I could break substitution ciphers by inspection alone. So they recruited me, trained me, put me to work at Bletchley Park doing what they called pattern analysis, which was a euphemism for breaking German codes. I worked there through the end of the war, analyzing Enigma traffic, identifying networks, mapping communication patterns. In 1945, when I was 9 years old, I was assigned to a special unit called Crosswind. He watched the committee members exchange glances, saw them making notes, saw the recognition on some faces. They had done their homework, had read the sparse classified files that mentioned Crosswind in passing, had come prepared but not fully prepared for what he was about to tell them. Crosswind's purpose was to identify and break Nazi intelligence ciphers in real time, often within hours of their transmission. We weren't working on Enigma anymore by that point. Enigma was essentially broken. We were working on the ciphers that German intelligence officers used when they didn't trust Enigma, when they needed something more secure, when they were transmitting information so sensitive that even their own encryption machinery wasn't considered safe enough. We succeeded in our mission. Our unit broke 42 separate cipher systems over the course of 8 months. We identified 3 major Nazi intelligence networks that were preparing to continue operations after Germany's surrender. We provided information that led to the arrest of over 200 German intelligence officers who had planned to disappear into civilian life and continue working for remnant Nazi organizations. We saved lives. We prevented terrorist attacks. We stopped assassination attempts against Allied leaders. We did work that officially never happened. When the war ended, we were given a choice: disappear into new identities with government support and protection, or face public inquiries that would expose our methods and endanger ongoing intelligence operations. All 7 of us chose disappearance. I was given the identity Marcus Helvetia, Swiss watchmaker, and I was relocated to Grindelwald, Switzerland in 1946. I was 10 years old. For the next 79 years, I have lived as a watchmaker. For 79 years, I have not spoken about Crosswind or my involvement with it. For 79 years, I have been protected by a network that I did not fully understand was still active until 6 weeks ago. The committee chair leaned forward. You're saying that Crosswind operatives have been in contact with each other for 79 years, without official oversight, without government knowledge or approval? Yes, Marcus said simply. What has this network been doing? Surviving, protecting each other, maintaining connections to intelligence information that was never properly declassified because declassifying it would have required admitting it existed in the first place. Continuing work that official intelligence agencies considered too dangerous or too ethically problematic to continue openly. Providing safe haven for people whose lives were endangered by work they did for Allied governments. Maintaining institutional memory that would otherwise have been lost when personnel died or when agencies reorganized and destroyed inconvenient records. Bearing witness. Essentially, the committee chair said carefully, a rogue intelligence operation. Not rogue, Marcus corrected. Autonomous. We operated with the knowledge but not the official approval of certain elements within British and American intelligence services. We weren't rebels or traitors. We were people who understood that the threats we had prepared for during the war did not end when the war ended. That the people we had saved would need protection in peacetime. That some truths needed to be preserved outside official channels that could be manipulated by political expediency. And you can verify all of this? Yes, I have decoded a document that contains the locations, identities, and operational status of every active member of the Crosswind network. 23 safe houses across 6 continents. 63 operatives at peak strength, down to 3 now including myself. Communication protocols that have been maintained continuously since 1945. A functioning intelligence network that has never appeared in any official budget, any oversight committee report, any historical accounting of post-war intelligence operations. It exists. It has always existed, and I can prove it. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Marcus presented the decoded cipher, explained the mathematical foundations of the encryption system, verified the authenticity of the locations and operational protocols. He answered questions about recruitment methods, about decision-making processes, about the ethical frameworks that had guided Crosswind's continued operations for 8 decades. He testified about specific operations, people who had been given sanctuary, information that had been preserved, threats that had been identified and neutralized quietly without official acknowledgement. He provided names of government officials who had known about the network and quietly supported it, even as they officially denied its existence. By the end, the committee had agreed to several things. First, a comprehensive declassification review of all remaining Crosswind documents, with the understanding that some material would remain classified indefinitely to protect still living operatives and ongoing operations that had grown out of the original network. Second, immunity granted to any operatives who came forward to provide testimony with protection for their legal identities and their families. Third, funding for a comprehensive historical investigation into the ethics and efficacy of post-war intelligence operations that existed outside official oversight, with Marcus serving as a consultant. Fourth, Marcus's detailed testimony would be sealed until after his death, but would then be made public to ensure the historical record was complete. Fifth, establishment of a memorial foundation to support the descendants of Crosswind operatives and to fund research into post-war intelligence history with an initial endowment of $5 million. When he left the hearing room 6 hours after he had entered it, Sarah was waiting in the hallway. She looked smaller somehow, as if testifying had taken physical mass from both of them. The burden of secrecy finally lifted, leaving them lighter, but also more fragile. "You did well," she said. "I told the truth," Marcus replied, "or as much of it as I was permitted to tell. That's what they wanted. That's what they needed. That's what we owed them, and ourselves. What happens now? Now we survive one more day. And tomorrow we survive one more day. And eventually we die, and the next generation inherits the knowledge that we kept it alive for them. And eventually, Crosswind becomes a historical footnote, a case study in intelligence ethics courses, a topic in dissertations, a truth that people argue about in academic journals and documentary films. And we become names in those studies, people who actually existed, who actually mattered, who chose to be remembered rather than forgotten." Marcus extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me a way to stop being invisible, for carrying the weight for 79 years so I didn't have to, for remembering when I forgot, for keeping faith." Sarah shook his hand, her grip still firm despite her age. "Thank you for being brave enough to remember when you could have stayed comfortable in forgetting. Thank you for choosing to be a witness instead of a ghost. Thank you for honoring their sacrifice by telling the truth." 2 months after the hearing, Marcus returned to Grindelwald. The watch shop had been closed for so long that dust had accumulated in patterns that suggested permanence, patterns that would have taken months to form. The landlord had prepared the space for sale, had catalogued the inventory, had begun conversations with auction houses about the watches. Marcus cancelled all of it, paid 3 years of back rent in cash, reopened the shop with a new sign on the door. Marcus Helvetia, horologist, appointments by request, historical consultations available. He repaired watches during the day, gave interviews to historians and journalists in the evenings, consulted on documentaries about Crosswind and post-war intelligence operations on weekends. He lived openly now as someone who had done important work, who had carried important secrets, who had chosen at the end of his life to become a witness rather than remain a ghost. The watch that had brought Sarah through his door, the watch with the serial number GX1847X, was donated to the British Museum as the centerpiece of a permanent exhibition titled Crosswind, the Secret Network. The placard beneath it read, "Pocket watch, circa 1935, modified 1945, containing encrypted communication protocols used in classified intelligence operations, 1945-2024. Owner and operator, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Crosswind 7. Decoded by Marcus Helvetia, Crosswind 1." The exhibition opened in March 2025. School groups came to see it. University students wrote papers about it. Historians studied the decoded cipher displayed in a secure case beside the watch. Journalists wrote articles with headlines like, "The Ghost Network Finally Revealed," 70 Years of Shadows Brought to Light, and How One Watch Changed History and Exposed a Secret Intelligence Network. Marcus died in December 2027, peacefully, of natural causes. His heart simply stopped one morning while he was winding a pocket watch at his workbench, a Patek Philippe from 1932, brought in for routine maintenance by a customer who had inherited it from their grandfather. He was found by that customer, slumped over his tools with a small smile on his face, as if he had been in the middle of understanding something profound and beautiful when death arrived. Sarah Chen attended the funeral, not as a member of his family, because officially he still had no family, but as a representative of the Crosswind Memorial Foundation, which had grown to employ 12 full-time staff researching post-war intelligence history and providing support to the families of people who had served in classified operations. At his grave in the Grindelwald Cemetery, with the Alps rising behind them in eternal witness, Sarah placed a small brass watch key worn smooth by 87 years of use. The key to winding time. The key to keeping secrets alive long enough for them to safely become history. The key to understanding that some truths refuse to die, no matter how long you try to hide them, no matter how comfortable forgetting might be. The watch in the British Museum continued to tick, wound every 72 hours by museum staff who had been trained in the proper technique by Marcus himself before he died. It sat behind reinforced glass, illuminated perfectly, maintained with a care that Marcus would have approved of, each tick marking time with the same precise attention it had given to every second since 1935. And the story continued, the way stories do when someone chooses to tell them rather than let them die in silence. The story of 7 people who had kept a secret for 79 years, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Because they understood that some work transcends official recognition. Some loyalty runs deeper than institutional affiliation. Some promises matter more than comfort or safety. The story of a network that should not have existed but did, that operated in the shadows for 8 decades protecting people who needed protection, preserving truths that needed preservation, bearing witness when official histories chose selective blindness. The story of a watchmaker who forgot who he had been and then remembered and then testified and then died and then became part of history, not as a footnote but as a witness, as someone whose life had mattered, whose choice to remember had honored the sacrifice of those who had never forgotten. And in safe houses scattered across 23 cities, now mostly closed but with a few still operational under new management, in archives being slowly opened to researchers, in the memories of families who were finally learning what their grandparents and great-grandparents had actually done during and after the war, the story continued. The watch ticked on, marking each second with mechanical precision, proving that some machines and some truths refuse to stop working just because the world has moved on, just because forgetting would be easier, just because official histories have declared them finished. Time continues, memory persists, witnesses bear witness, and sometimes, after long silence, truth finally finds its voice.